On April 9th, 1694, a Scottish man named John Law walked into Bloomsbury Square in London and killed somebody, not metaphorically. He ran his sword through a man named Edward Bow Wilson in a duel over a woman neither of them would ever get. Wilson bled out on the cobblestones. Law was arrested, convicted of murder at the Old Bailey by a judge so notorious for hangings that contemporaries called him infamously sadistic, and sentenced to death. He somehow negotiated the charge down to manslaughter. Then he escaped from prison before anyone could rearrest him and fled to the continent. 26 years later, he controlled the entire French economy. He spent the next 2 decades as a professional gambler, not the desperate losing kind, the precise, mathematical kind. Law understood probability better than almost anyone in Europe in 1694. He'd worked it through from first principles. The odds on any game, the edge in any bet, how to stay in the game long enough for the numbers to land in your favor. He worked the card tables of Rome, Amsterdam, Copenhagen, and Venice with the patience of a man who knew time was on his side. He made money, lost money, made it back. He built a reputation across Europe as someone you did not want sitting opposite you with real stakes on the table. And while he played, he was thinking about money, about what it actually was, about why economies grew and why they collapsed under conditions that looked identical. He had a theory. It was a good one. He tried to sell it to Scotland in 1705. Rejected. He approached England. Not interested. He worked through the Italian states and the French court. Nobody bought it. For 20 years, John Law wandered Europe with a great idea and no one to sell it to. Then France ran out of money, and someone introduced him to the right duke. When Louis XIV died in September 1715, he left France with roughly 3 billion livres in debt, a number approximately equal to a full year of everything the country produced, not a fraction of it. The whole thing. Annual revenue ran to about 145 million livres. Running the country cost about 142 million. That left 3 million livres a year, against a debt of 3 billion. At that rate, paying it down, principal alone, ignoring interest entirely, would take 1,000 years. France wasn't struggling. France was mathematically impossible. The new king was 5 years old. Real power sat with his regent, Philippe, Duke of Orléans. Intelligent, dissolute, and completely out of options. Creditors hadn't been paid. The army hadn't been fully paid. Even Versailles was running on borrowed credibility. Philippe was introduced to John Law and granted him an audience. He had nothing to lose. Law's argument had 2 parts. The first, money is not gold. Gold is just a thing people agreed to treat as valuable. There is nothing sacred about it. What an economy actually runs on is confidence. A piece of paper backed by a credible institution is just as good as a coin, and it has one decisive advantage. You can print more of it when the economy needs a push. This was radical in 1716. Every serious economist in Europe believed money was metal. The whole point of money was that it couldn't be conjured out of nothing. The second idea: what if France converted its crushing, unpayable debt into shares in a company? Instead of the government owing fixed interest it couldn't pay, the creditors would become shareholders in a trading enterprise. One positioned to generate enormous profits from France's colonial territory in North America. The debt would still exist in a sense, but it would be transformed into something that could rise in value rather than simply sitting there strangling the state with interest payments it would never make. Philippe gave him permission to try. In May 1716, Law opened the Banque Générale in Paris, a private bank issuing paper notes backed by silver, usable for paying taxes. The notes circulated. Commerce picked up. By 1718, Philippe nationalized the bank, renamed it the Banque Royale, and backed its notes with the full credit of the French state. Paper money was now real. The debt problem remained. Law needed the company. He got control of the Compagnie d'Occident, the Company of the West, in 1717. It held France's trading rights to the Mississippi Valley, the vast expanse of territory along the river that France had been claiming for
Mississippi Company and immediately launched the greatest promotional campaign in history. The Mississippi Valley, Law's materials insisted, was rich with gold, silver, furs, and farmland of extraordinary fertility. He sent recruiters through France and Germany to find settlers. Pamphlets described Louisiana as paradise. Engravings showed indigenous people handing Europeans baskets of silver ore, as if the entire continent was simply waiting to be picked up. Louisiana in reality was swamp, malaria, and a few hundred dying colonists around a new port called New Orleans. Founded in 1718, population several hundred, mortality rate alarming. There was no gold, there was no silver. The furs existed in limited quantities, nowhere near enough to justify what was about to happen to the company's share price. But Law wasn't selling Louisiana, he was selling the idea of it. By 1719, he had absorbed every French overseas trading monopoly into the company. Tobacco, the African trade, the mint, the entire tax collection system. In January 1720, Philippe named him Controller General of Finance. John Law now controlled France's currency, France's taxes, and France's largest company. Simultaneously, no individual in European history had ever concentrated that much financial power in a single pair of hands. Shares went on sale at 500 livres in early 1719. By December, they traded at 10,000, a 1900% gain in under a year. Rue Quincampoix was a street in Paris, barely wide enough for a single carriage. By mid-1719, it was so Mississippi shares that the city imposed mandatory closing hours. Otherwise, the crowd never thinned. A hunchbacked man rented out his curved back as a writing surface for investors who needed somewhere to sign their contracts. It's the story every memoir of the period tells. He charged by the signature. Business was brisk enough that he retired on it. The word millionaire was coined in French during this period. The language had never needed it before. Servants quit. Coachmen fired their employers and hired their own drivers. A nobleman's footman who had quietly bought shares with years of saved wages bought his former employer's Paris estate from the creditors after the nobleman sold it to speculate further. The Duc du Saint-Simon, who documented the period in obsessive detail, wrote that Law's carriage could barely move through the city streets. The crowd surrounded it. Law received 150 visitors a day at his Paris residence. Foreign ambassadors requested audiences with him before they requested audiences with the regent. New tailors opened to dress the newly rich. New jewelers opened to sell to them. The price of domestic servants doubled and then doubled again because there were so few willing to remain in service. Paris felt physically like it was vibrating. People camped overnight on Rue Quincampoix to hold their place in the trading queue. Philippe threw parties at Versailles to celebrate France's economic resurgence. France, for the first time in anyone's living memory, felt wealthy, and Law had actually done something brilliant. He had taken 3 billion livres of suffocating national debt and converted most of it into Mississippi shares. Creditors who had been holding government IOUs that lost value every year were now shareholders in the most celebrated company in Europe. The debt still existed, in a different form, but instead of requiring fixed interest France couldn't pay, it had been transformed into something contingent on the company's future success. The system needed one thing to work. For Louisiana to eventually produce something, it didn't have to be gold or silver, it just had to be enough. Enough commerce, enough revenue from any source.
The shareholders had a reason to keep holding at 10,000 livres instead of selling. The moment enough of them decided the shares were worth less, the whole structure would compress quickly. The settlers were dying. The gold was not there. The silver was not there. The company's actual revenue was negligible against what its share price implied. Law knew it. He'd known it for months before most of his investors had any idea. But he genuinely believed Louisiana would eventually catch up, that if he could buy enough time, the territory would become what he'd said it was. He thought he could manage it. He thought he could land the plane. He couldn't find the runway. To keep the shares from falling, Law kept printing money. Every time confidence wobbled, the Banque Royale issued more notes. In 18 months, he more than doubled France's entire money supply. By May 1720, the total paper in circulation was roughly 4 times larger than the gold it was supposedly backed by. Monthly inflation in January 1720 hit 23%, not annually, per month. Food prices climbed 60% in a matter of months. The people who hadn't bought Mississippi shares, which was the overwhelming majority of France, the poor, the farmers, the day laborers, were paying more for bread than they had the previous year. Their purchasing power was being silently extracted and transferred to the shareholders on Rue Quincampoix. They had no shares to compensate them. On May 21st, 1720, Law tried to land the plane. He issued a royal decree ordering a gradual 6-month reduction in Mississippi share values, a controlled deflation, he calculated, towards something defensible. He believed slow adjustment would prevent panic. It caused immediate panic. The decree was reversed within days. It didn't matter. Everyone who had been quietly wondering whether any of this was real had their answer. Law himself had just admitted the shares were overvalued. On May 29th, 8 days after the decree, Law was dismissed as Comptroller General, but the panic he'd started did not stop when he did. Through June and into July, the crowds kept coming to the Banque Royale, paper notes in hand, demanding the gold the notes had promised. There wasn't enough gold. There had never been enough gold. That was always the point. To slow the drain, the bank began rationing how much coin it would hand over, a little at a time. So people had to come back day after day, and each day the queues grew longer and more desperate. Soldiers were posted to hold them back. On July 17th, 1720, the crowd outside the bank on the Rue Vivienne pressed so hard against itself that 15 people were crushed to death. The bodies were carried through the streets to the courtyard of the Palais Royal and laid out beneath the regent's windows so he could see what his money had done. The Banque Royale was declared bankrupt in October. Shares hit 2,000 livres by September, 1,000 by December. Within 2 years, they were back to 500. Law fled France in December 1720. He left wearing borrowed clothes, with diamonds sewn into the lining of his coat, in a borrowed carriage on borrowed horses. There was effectively a warrant out for his arrest if he stayed. 8 months earlier, he had been the most powerful financial figure in Europe. He left France the way he had first left Britain 26 years before, on the run and moving fast. He drifted. Brussels. London briefly. Strange, given the murder warrant still technically unresolved. Back to Venice. He sold off what remained of his assets to live on. He kept writing economic theory until the end. He died in Venice in 1729, in a rented room, nearly alone, with almost nothing. France didn't recover its faith in banks for 70 years. That distrust had consequences that compounded in ways people rarely account for. France stumbled through the rest of the 18th century with a financial system unable to support its ambitions. When the 7 Years' War required the kind of large-scale borrowing that Britain managed with relative ease. Because Britain had functioning financial institutions its citizens trusted. France couldn't raise money the same way. Each crisis built on the last. By 1789, the French crown was mathematically insolvent again, for many of the same structural reasons Law had tried to solve in 1716. This time there was no Scottish gambler with a theory. There was a revolution instead. Here is the strange part. Law was right. The Federal Reserve does something very close to what John Law was doing on Rue Quincampoix in 1719. So does the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, and every other functioning modern central bank. Paper money backed by institutional confidence rather than gold. Sovereign debt converted into tradable instruments. Money supply expanded or contracted to stimulate or cool an economy. These ideas are not radical anymore.
They are the operating system of global finance. Law was 3 centuries too early, and his underlying asset, Louisiana, turned out to be swamp and mosquitoes rather than the goldfield he needed. The confidence ran out before the territory could produce anything real. Every central banker who has run a quantitative easing program since 2008 is, in some philosophical sense, doing what law attempted. The difference is that modern currencies are backed by something more defensible than the promise of silver ore that didn't exist, and the institutions administering them have had 3 centuries of disasters to learn from, including his.
The hunchback of Rue Quincampoix made his money